In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how you can model a vehicle system. So imagine that you have a game like something like we've got here in Trisbort. This is just a kind of a concept just to illustrate the point. It's not a real game. But imagine that my game is broken up into distinct areas. So, an example I could think of would be, Infocom's Sherlock game, where there's different regions of London, and to get from one region to the other, you get in a horse-drawn carriage, and the driver asks you, where would you like to go? That's a very common design pattern in games. You get in the taxi and it says where to now, right? And then you pick from a menu where you'd like to go. So let's look at how we could do that in Lantern. In the example that we've got we'll have 4 separate areas. And what we're going to do is we're going to put a cab or a taxi at each area. And when we get in a particular taxi, it will present us with a particular menu. So let's go over to Lantern again and take a look. So in my scenario here, I've got residential area, industrial area, outside stadium, and spaceport. I have 4. Those are sort of the anchor points of my 4 regions, and that's where the taxis are going to drop me off. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to have 4 different taxis, one at every area. So you can see this is Space Taxi 1, Space Taxi 2, Space Taxi 3, Space Taxi 4. To the user, it's not really going to be obvious if it's the same taxi or not. And when the player gets in one of those taxis, they will be given a menu option of where they want to go. So you're going to have 4 different functions, one for each possible taxi. Each function is going to look a little bit different, but they'll all be kind of clones of each other. Now, to make the taxis enterable, you have to set the direction. Entering them needs to lead to a room. And what we can do here is just say, if you try to enter the taxi, now you're inside the taxi. So we're going to make the taxi enterable by saying, well, if you enter the taxi, you end up in, you might not be able to see it there because of the recording window, but so we'll say that entering Space Taxi 1 leads to Space Taxi 1. So we'd actually be inside that object. Now, so that will make the space taxis enterable. If you just leave it as you can't go that way, you won't be able to enter the taxi. So now let's look at what we can do here. Oh, I had this code here, but I didn't really. Let me delete it and start over. Nah, I'll delete it and start over. Okay. So let's do this all from the beginning. What we're going to do here is make a function for entering Space Taxi 1. Delete. All right, so I'm going to call this enter taxi 1. So this is for getting in the first taxi, and let me click add. Now, if I right click on the code window, you see now I've added a stub for create a vehicle menu. Where would you like to go? ? So let's select that. And let's look at what we've got. It says you'll need to add this variable. So we need to add a variable called loop done. So I'm going to go do that now. Eventually, I'd like to get this so if it adds a variable, it would add that variable to your project. So I'm going to go over to the variables tab, and I'm going to add loop done and set it to 0. Variable updated. Cool. All right, now let's go back to functions here. And what it does is it's going to set that loop variable to 0. And then it's going to print out the driver turns around and asks you where to, boss, and you can change that text. And now we've got something called a while loop. A while loop is kind of a repeating if statement. And it's going to keep repeating until we set loop done to true. And why are we doing this? Well, it's like we've given the player's going to enter 1, 2, 3, or 4, but what if they enter 5 or 6 or garbage? Those aren't valid options. So we want to keep looping. We want to keep asking the player until we get a valid number or a valid result back. So this is just a repeating if statement. It's going to repeat until this condition is false. So now we're going to print out our menu system. And the menu system is going to be dependent on which taxi it is, right? So if I go to my map here and I'm at the residential area, I could go to the industrial area, the stadium, or the spaceport. So when I enter taxi 1, I'm going to say which one of these 4 places do you want to go, or option 4 to get out of the taxi. Maybe I'll say get out of taxi or something. No, I'll just leave it like that. That's fine. Okay, so now we're going to ask the user a question, and what that does is it puts it stores the answer in a variable called answer. So you're asking the player for something, and you're going to get back this answer. So now what we're going to do is say, okay, well, if the answer was 1, now then we're going to print, okay, let's go to the stadium. And now we're going to put the player at the stadium. Actually, I think in my game, it was outside stadium. And you're going to have to change these object locations, but to match your game, but that should be easy. Now, once we've got a valid option, we're going to set loop done to 1, and that's going to stop the repetition. We won't keep asking the player because we're saying, hey, we don't want to loop anymore. We're done. All right, and then since we've changed the player's location, we're going to run the look command to print out the description of the new location. So what we're saying here is, okay, ask the player which one of these places they want to go. If they want to go to place 1, print, okay, I'll take you there. Put the player there, and then set your little variable to stop, to say I'm done, and then run the look command. So we'll do that for these other choices as well. And these are all just cookie cutters. And then if they say option 4, then we'll just say, oh, you know what we'll say? Okay, you get out of the cab or something. You can change that to be whatever you want. And now we're done. We don't want to keep looping. So, and then otherwise, if it wasn't 1, 2, 3, or 4, it must have just been garbage. So we'll print invalid option. So what we're doing is we're repeating this if statement. We're repeating this until we get a valid answer. And if we get a valid answer, it's going to be a place to go, in which case we just move the player there and then print out the location of the description of the new location, and then set our little variable so we stop looping. And otherwise, if the player says, you know what, I just want to get out of the taxi, then we'll say, okay, fine, you're done, but we don't change the player's location. All right, so now that we have that function, let me save this. I need to wire it up to a sentence, right? So I'll say, if the player tries to go in or enter the space taxi, or no, I got to pick which one, space taxi 1, then call the function enter taxi 1. So now when I try to enter the taxi, it's going to do this code instead. So let's test it out. Okay, so I'm at the residential area. There's a space taxi parked here. I should have put a period there. Okay, and now let's say enter taxi, or get in cab, or something like that. Okay, the driver turns around and says, where to, boss? All right, so now it's popped up this little box asking me for something. So now let me say, okay, you know what? I want to go to the spaceport. To the spaceport it is, okay. And now we're at the spaceport. This is a bustling spaceport. There's a taxi parked here. Okay, so that's not the same taxi though. So let's go do this for taxi 2. So what I'm going to do is go to my functions, and I'll say I'm going to make a function called enter taxi 2. Click add, and then what I'm going to do here is just copy all of this. I think I missed a slash up there. Okay, so now if I'm at the, let's see, enter taxi 2. Where is taxi 2? So taxi 2 is going to be at the factory. So for taxi 2, I don't want to go to the factory. I want to go to the residential area. And maybe I'll fix the case on it. And then down here for option 2, I'll say, to the residential area it is. And then I'll put the player in the residential area. And same thing. All right, so now let's go add a sentence for that. And if I go enter space taxi 2, I want to call the enter space taxi 2 function and click add. Okay, so now let's try this. There's a space taxi parked here. I'm going to enter cab. Okay, there we go. I made cab a synonym for taxi. The driver turns around and says, "Where to, boss?" And now it's going to ask me where I want to go. And let me say I want to go to the factory. Is that right? Oh, to the industrial area it is. It is pitch dark. Okay, so I didn't make the industrial area lit. That's a problem. Let's go make that lit. Let's make sure outside stadium is lit and the spaceport is lit. And let's run it again. Okay, so there's a space taxi here. Enter cab. Let's go to the factory. Okay, so to the industrial area it is. Okay, industrial area. This is a bustling industrial area. There's a space taxi parked here. Okay, cool. So let's get back in the taxi. Enter taxi. Or enter the cab. Okay, where to? So notice the options are different now because we're already at the factory, so that shouldn't be an option now. And it's going to say which way do you want to go. And now I bet we could go back to the residential area. And now we're back at the residential area. So really what we have to do is have a taxi at each location, make sure that taxi is enterable, and then in your make functions for getting in each one of the vehicles, and the options will be slightly different for each location, but they'll all generally be clones of each other. And once you've got one, you can just copy and paste it to make the others, right? So there you go. So the point is you can make a vehicle system pretty easily. You just have to have a vehicle at each place. Make sure that that vehicle is enterable by saying if you enter that vehicle, you enter that thing, you end up inside it. And then you just have to make your functions, one for each taxi, and then create a sentence that says, okay, if I try to enter the space taxi, or if I try to enter taxi 1, call the enter taxi 1 function. If I enter taxi 2, call the enter taxi 2 function. All right, so there it is. There's how to model a vehicle system. Not too hard. I mean, it's not hard. There's just some repetition, but yeah, you can definitely do it, and then you can have a game that's broken up into different regions, and that's kind of cool.